Welcome to the CDA Institute's Geopolitical Update. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the Institute, and I'm joined by geopolitical expert Joseph Varner, Deputy Director of the Conference of Defense Associations and former Director of Policy for the Minister of National Defense. In this podcast, Joe will provide his analysis and insights on the most significant geopolitical and international security developments of the week. So grab your headphones and get ready for a concise but comprehensive update on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Joe, great to be with you again for the Geopolitical Update. Can you provide our listeners with a brief overview of what's been happening on the global stage this week? What are the key highlights and trends that we should be aware of before we get into more specifics?
Josh, three stories this week that are of particular interest are the assassination of the Hamas leader in Tehran, sabotage and disruptions in France that could be Russian hybrid warfare, and dictator Nicolas Maduro's reelection as president in Venezuela.
Well, thanks, Joe. Why don't we start with the assassination of the Hamas leader in Tehran?
So this week saw the assassination of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. And Haniyeh was in Tehran for the inauguration of the new Iranian president, along with his colleagues from terrorist organizations backed by Iran, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and a host of other smaller terrorist groups in the Middle East that are part of Iran's ring of fire around Israel. Haniyeh was assassinated in the morning on Wednesday, along with a bodyguard. It's not entirely clear yet how he was assassinated. There have been stories that he was gunned down. There have been stories that it was a missile strike from outside Iran's borders, and even a bomb attack as of today. But the lead suspect in the assassination is, of course, Israel's intelligence service. And that remains at this point speculation. Israel has not taken credit for the hit. Certainly in the aftermath of the surprise October 7th attacks, Israel vowed to hunt down and kill the Hamas leadership, including Haniyeh. And Haniyeh and the other terrorist leaders were guests in Iran under the protection of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The assassination sends a clear message that even with the full protection of Iran's terrorist leaders are vulnerable, and that there is no safe place for them to hide. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said the United States was not involved and was not aware of the assassination. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, responded to Haniyeh's assassination and said that Iran considers revenge as a duty and has directed the Iranian armed forces to carry out a revenge attack. Hamas immediately blamed Israel and called for revenge. And certainly the view of Iran is that it was an Israeli hit. Earlier on Tuesday, the Israeli Air Force eliminated the chief of staff and third in command of Hezbollah in an airstrike on a Beirut suburb. One thing is clear: Israel's intelligence and reach in Lebanon and Iran is superb. And if Israel assassinated Haniyeh, and it looks like it likely did, it has penetrated the Iranian security and intelligence services at a very high level. All this against the backdrop of increasing conflict and tensions between Israel and Hezbollah and their Iranian masters that could lead to all-out war in the Middle East.
The Paris Olympics are ongoing, as I'm sure everyone knows, and France has been susceptible to Russian hybrid warfare. So, Joe, perhaps you could touch on this emerging story.
So saboteurs struck France's high-speed train network on Friday of last week with the pre-dawn attacks on signal substations and cables at critical points, causing basic travel chaos hours before the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics. All trains were back up and running by Monday morning, but about 250,000 people were inconvenienced the day of the opening ceremonies, and about 800,000 over the weekend by the travel disruptions. Left-wing extremists have a history of arson and sabotage attacks on trains in France, and certainly were initially the chief suspects. Whether they acted on their own or for a foreign country like Russia, which has been engaged in hybrid warfare campaign against NATO Europe, remains in question. The last 6 months have seen the Russians engage in attempted assassination, arson, sabotage, cyber, disinformation, influence activities related to elections, and GPS jamming of civilian air flights, and even likely tampering of undersea cables. The fact that the sabotage of the train system was followed by mass power outages within a day or so has many casting a gaze at Russia as the culprit in organizing the disruptions in France. And this would certainly be in an attempt to embarrass the already unstable Macron government and discourage them from sending military trainers and aid to Ukraine, as Macron himself has promised.
Well, thanks, Joe. Maybe we can move on to the final story of the day, which is the recent Venezuela election and the quote unquote re-election of Maduro.
The situation in Venezuela remains tense after President and dictator Nicolas Maduro was declared president in what's viewed as a rigged election over his opponent and retired diplomat, Edmundo Gonzalez. Protests have broken out in the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, and many have disputed the election result. The military and the police so far have remained loyal to Maduro and have fired tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters. Leading NGOs in the country say people have been injured and even died. A number of Latin American countries, such as Uruguay, Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and the Dominican Republic, have all urged for an emergency meeting of the Organization of American States to review the results. And the Venezuelan government has withdrawn all of its diplomatic staff from the embassies of most of those countries. The big question will be whether China, Cuba, and Russia move to prop up the Maduro regime in the face of US and regional OAS pressure, and what that looks like. And if that happens, we'll get a look and see whether the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well, or finally dead. And it will be another test for lame duck President Joe Biden.
Thanks, Joe. Those are the top three stories of the day, but what else do you think that people should be paying attention to over the next few days and into next week?
Stories to watch include a potential nuclear test in North Korea, the Wagner Group defeat in battle in Mali, and a new Cuban Missile Crisis. There are indications that North Korea may be considering a nuclear test during the run-up to the U.S. presidential election to potentially raise its profile and interfere in the U.S. election in favor of former President Donald Trump. There's a view that the North Koreans would like to restart nuclear negotiations with the United States. North Korea last tested a nuclear device in September 2017, its most powerful atomic bomb by far, with an estimated yield of about 120 to 250 kilotons. And the North Korean test facility sits ready for another nuclear test and only waits for political direction to carry out that nuclear explosion. Russia's Wagner Group got into a fight in Mali, backing the Malian army against Tuareg separatist militants, and took it on the nose, with dozens killed and wounded. There are reports that Tuareg militia forces were backed by Ukrainian intelligence and special forces in a sandstorm ambush that inflicted heavy casualties on the Mali government forces and the Wagner Group. And you might have expected that the Russian military high command and foreign ministry would be concerned about the fate of their countrymen in Africa. But the rumor is there's still so much animosity between the Russian general staff and foreign ministry and the Wagner Group in military circles that there was a degree of amusement or disinterest in Russian military circles. And there's always been that animosity, but it seems to have broken into view again with this defeat. And there's a view that the Wagner Group has been sent off to Africa to meet its demise, the end of an inconvenient problem for the Russian government. And lastly, there are reports that suggest that the Russian, in response to U.S. threats to place new dual-use missiles in Europe, may respond by basing missiles and potentially nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, along with a permanent Russian military presence to operate and safeguard the weapons. kind of a modern replay of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. It would be in addition to Cuba's rapidly expanding Chinese intelligence gathering operation there. And this would lead to further tensions with the United States, and is again geared by the Russians to dissuade the United States from placing missiles and extending deterrence to its allies in Europe. So until next week.
Joe, thank you once again for your insightful analysis and for guiding us through this week's geopolitical developments. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in once again. Be sure to check us out next week as we reconvene with Joe to delve into another week of global affairs. Thank you, everyone.